We finally got a release date trailer, and I'm quite pleased with that. I think August 2023 is perfectly fine. To be perfectly honest, I wasn't one of these people that was terribly worried about the release date. Even if it had been 2024, it wouldn't have bothered me all too much. But I think it's a good thing. We now know that in August 2023, the full release of Baldur's Gate will be upon us, and that's something to definitely look forward to. Needless to say, there are a number of very interesting reveals in this trailer. Never before seen footage, never before seen characters. Obviously, the big highlights here are both Jaheira and Minsc, and I also want to take a little bit of a dive into the novel things that we saw, but let's talk about Jaheira and Minsc first. Jaheira, same voice actress, clearly, very cool. She looks older, which makes sense. She's a half-elf, and half-elves do live longer than humans, so Jaheira probably didn't undergo any weird transformation or state of affairs like Minsc did, having been a statue trapped within a petrification spell. But she's there. We all know that Jaheira is associated with the Harpers, and is clearly going to be opposed, as she states in the trailer, to whatever the Absolute is planning. But one thing I have to say, and I think it's clear from the trailer, is she's almost certainly not a companion. Very, very unlikely. Now, I could be wrong about this, but I think she's more of an important NPC based on the limited presentation here. In part because of the way she introduces Minsc. She says, here I have this friend, he sees things more simply, and he too was trapped with the Mind Flayers, implying that he's going to join up with your cause, and he's going to wreak havoc on them, because as she says, she almost feels sorry for the enemy. But from her perspective, it doesn't sound like she was captured by the Cult of the Absolute, or the Mind Flayers, so she's more of an observer. I expect her to be an important NPC, as I said, and that's perfectly fine. But we will be getting Minsc, and as I just made a video quite recently about Minsc, go check it out in the link. Minsc should make for an interesting companion, indeed, because he has lost his memories, as I indicated in my previous video. Check it out. And I wonder if the tadpole will, in fact, reignite those memories and make him whole again. We'll see. In the same way that Astarion is able to withstand the sunlight. All that said, let's have a look at all the cool stuff that is completely new that we haven't seen before in the game, and we can make some hypotheses and speculate about these things. It'll be fun. First novel thing we see is some dark, ominous, mysterious fortress, presumably the Fortress of the Absolute, because that's the context in which it's mentioned. She talks about facing the Cult of the Absolute, Jaheira does, so that will probably be a place we will almost certainly visit. Not terribly much else to say about that, because it just looks like a dark and ominous fortress. Very nice. Then we see some kind of soldier with tattered, black-feathered wings. He could be a soldier of the Flaming Fist. It's not entirely clear. It could be some type of spell. Normally I have a pretty good eye for these things, but I'm not exactly sure what's going on with this particular soldier, but it is novel. We've not yet seen that in early access. Then we see a very interesting cauldron of some sort containing various Mind Flayer tadpoles, almost certainly linked to their magical Netherese nature. Hard to say exactly what kind of magical thing is going on here, although it does, like I said, look like a cauldron, and it kind of reminds me on some level of the cauldron you might encounter of a night hag, for example. Night hags are lower planar hags that trade in larvae, which is to say the souls of evil mortals throughout the lower planes. They have a lot of bargaining power. Kind of resembles that. I'm not saying that that is what it is, but it could be something similar. So that's a very interesting addition. Or it could be the standard Mind Flayer pool from which tadpoles are extracted, but it looks very small, very bunched up, and it is not what I'm traditionally familiar with. And the way they look and the way they're interacting there tells me that it's probably not that, but it could just be a standard tadpole pool. But for some reason, I don't think it is. The next very interesting and novel revelation, it appears to be, is that the spokesman of the Absolute that we meet when we're trying to enter the Goblin Stronghold in early access, you know, the scene where you're brought to your knees and the Githyanki artifact saves you, as it were. Here we see that in fact these spokesmen are in fact Drow. none other than Drow. And that makes a lot of sense because we've been asking ourselves for quite some time, how are the Drow involved in this? Drow don't normally have anything to do with the Dead Three, with Bane, Myrkul, and Baal, so why would they be involved? Of course, this doesn't tell us why the Drow are involved, but it does show that Drow involvement goes very high up indeed in terms of the hierarchy, since these individuals we're looking at are clearly all Dark Elves, or Drow, and it shows you that the Drow are knee-deep into this. Furthermore, we know that from scenes in Early Access of interacting with various characters, that if you are a Lulthsworn Drow, you're actually not necessarily on the side of the Absolute, quite the opposite. Those Drow who've chosen to follow the Absolute are actually opposed to Lulth's interest, which shouldn't surprise anybody. So we actually see Jaheira here. She looks aged and somewhat older, wiser, nothing necessarily new there. We heard her voice before, so there she is. Seems to look the part. And the next novel thing we see is the statue of either an elf or a half-elf who looks to be a priest of Selûne. You can see very clearly the symbols of Selûne there, very, very clearly etched into his garb, and he is petrified or a statue or something. It's not entirely clear, but his surroundings are very mysterious, dark, foreboding, sinister even. And I think his surroundings might be indicative of the so-called Shadowlands, this path that we can embark on, hopefully in full release, that will entail us entering into the actual Shadowfell. It looks like that. It looks like somebody who is trapped within the Shadowfell for whatever reason, because the surroundings are very dark, they look very evil, so it's hard to say, but definitely a follower of Selûne, the goddess of the moon. And here we see a scene that you should be familiar with from the Grim Forge, because when you are looking from the Grim Forge out into the distance, you will spy a certain Temple of Shar, and I am quite convinced, based on the symbolism here, based on what we can see here, that this is in fact the same Temple of Shar that you can see from the Grim Forge. So obviously we're going to be adventuring in this temple, something to look forward to. Looks dark and mysterious, unsurprising. Then we see another scene which may be a temple, and I have to tell you, to me it's reminiscent of the temple that you encounter in Baldur's Gate 2, the temple of the deity named a Monitor. A Monitor was the Netherese sun god, the god of order, the sun and law, and sometimes time. And I'm just speculating here. I am not saying I'm particularly convinced here, but looking at some of the outstretched symbols, some of this, I get the sense that it could be some sort of temple, some kind of place related to a Monitor. It might not be, but it's something to consider, especially given the history of a Monitor in Baldur's Gate 2, because we know for sure that Larian wants to connect these games in various ways. And if you wanted proof in the pudding that my suggestion that hallway might somehow be related to the Netherese sun god, a Monitor, then this scene, which is clearly a temple of some sort, which I think is connected to that hallway scene, is perhaps not 100% proof, but maybe 75% proof. The symbolism, the statues, it is very much reminiscent of this ancient Netherese deity. And another thing to add here is that we know the Netherese are involved. So why wouldn't an ancient Netherese sun god in some capacity be involved in all of this too? This is very clearly to me an indication that it's very likely that the Netherese sun god, a Monitor, is in some capacity involved in this, and connecting the hallway to this makes sense to me. We see a bunch of new gameplay, a mimic. We've seen mimics before, and it's very clear that the protagonist they've decided to use for the trailer is a paladin. You can see her weapon light up with some kind of holy illumination when she's attacking, and we will be getting the paladin very soon in early access, so that's a nice new thing that has been added. And we see a few spells that have not yet been released for early access, such as Lightning Bolt and Fly. And one more thing to note, just before Gale tosses his Lightning Bolt, you can see a very familiar enemy, an archetype that we have encountered time and time again throughout D&D and similar RPGs, and that is the Kobold. The Kobold has clearly made its return to Baldur's Gate 3, and we will be presumably shooting lightning bolts and throwing fireballs at them. So, another thing to note. And here we see what is possibly the most interesting reveal of the trailer, namely a celestial servant of the goddess of the moon, Selûne. It's not entirely clear what type of celestial servant this is. I could say it's a deva, which is a standard servant of the gods from the upper planes. It could be even one of the famous shards of Selûne, which is an elite cadre of planetar servants, and planetars are among the most powerful of the celestial servants of the gods. Or it could be some other type of angelic being. Hard to say based on the footage, but it is almost certainly a celestial servant of Selûne. You can see very clearly the type of symbols etched into the armor. They are all reminiscent of the moon. It's very clear to me that this is some kind of celestial servant of Selûne, maybe a deva, maybe a planetar, not entirely clear, but this for me absolutely is the highlight of the trailer. Now on top of all of this, another very interesting thing being featured here is the background. This background is very much, to me, reminiscent of the astral plane. You can see a bit of debris, the coloring. It looks like the astral plane to me. And this reinforces the idea that this in fact could be a deva. There are three types of devas, which are angelic servants of the gods. You have so-called movonic devas, which serve the interests of the gods on the prime material plane, the negative energy plane, and the positive energy plane. You have the monodic devas that serve the interests of the gods on the elemental planes, the inner planes, and the ethereal planes. And finally, the most powerful of them, and I think very likely this angelic being that we encounter here, you have the astral devas, who serve the interests of the gods on the outer planes, and above all, on the astral plane. You frequently encounter them in the context of rescue missions. So this background that we see this angelic deva in looks like something that is very different from the prime material plane, and like I said, if I had to hedge my bets, I would say it is the astral plane, and that this in fact is an astral deva servant of the moon goddess Selûne. Very, very cool stuff. A final piece of evidence to adduce is the simple fact that the astral plane is a recurrent theme in Baldur's Gate 3. The Githyanki live on the astral plane, even though they're not native there. Lae'zel talks a lot about the astral plane, and even Gale, in his quest to get rid of the insidious artifact in his chest, has mentioned, on one occasion, going to the astral plane to release the destructive magic contained therein. So, further supporting evidence. Then a giant tentacle of some sort, and this could be any number of things, I'm not going to speculate. Interesting, nonetheless. But one thing that does seem likely is that the location of this tentacle seems eerily similar to that dark, mysterious, ominous fortress that is probably linked to the Absolute. Maybe it's a temple, maybe it's a stronghold, who knows. That's probably where this is taking place, although as I said, I'm not sure what this tentacle is. And here we have a very interesting scene, an enemy party of mixed composition. We have, perhaps most interestingly, a Drider, more on that in a little bit, goblins, and what appears to be, in my humble speculation, half-orcs. These could very well be half-orcs. They're very broad-shouldered, they have a kind of almost cavemanish look to them. One of them is purple, you might think it's a Drow, but Drow don't really look like that. And one of them is green. So I actually think these are half-orcs that are in the company of these goblins and the Drider. But interesting addition if in fact they are half-orcs. But the truly big reveal here is, as I said, the Drider. For those of you who don't know, Driders are hideous combinations of both Drow and spiders, and Driders are almost invariably the result of a curse. If a Drow has failed in some capacity in Drow society, and more importantly, if he or she has failed in his or her service to Lolth, the Spider Queen, then in conjunction with Lolth, a Drow can be turned into a Drider as punishment. Typically, they lose a lot of their intellect. They're not all there, as it were, but it's difficult to say here. Very interesting nonetheless, because we see an alliance, again, of various factions we've seen before. Drow aligned with the Absolute, and we also have a little goblin there, and a Drider who, oddly enough, is following the Absolute. Now, this might make sense from a lore perspective, because Lolth, in conjunction with her priestesses, has cursed Driders to be the way they are. So this Drider might be acting in opposition to Lolth, hence having allied itself with the cult of the Absolute. Speculating again, but it is logical speculation, I would argue. Then we see some kind of alliance of the adventuring party with the tieflings, with Jaheira, and possibly with the Flaming Fist. It's not entirely clear. I'd wager there are some Harper members there too, if I had to hazard a guess. And they are facing off against what is clearly a group allied to the Absolute. You can see the soldiers in the back, the cloth that they're bearing. That is almost certainly the symbol of the Absolute, and looks very similar, of course, to the old symbol of Bane. No coincidence. Obviously, spectral enemies there. These are definitely servants of the Absolute. And I think one important thing to point out here for the record is that this is the first time we are seeing servants of the Absolute actually bearing a standard, which is to say a symbol of the Absolute. As I just mentioned, the tunic or the cloth that these soldiers are wearing has the symbol of the Absolute. Hitherto, it's been the case that we encounter various personages who say, I serve the Absolute, I'm a servant of the Absolute, but they bear neither an explicit visual symbol nor do they carry a standard. And here we actually see for the first time both a standard and a symbol of the Absolute, which tells us that the Absolute has in fact an army of some sort. And here we see some of those units within the army. And we see here in this scene that Jaheira, who is traditionally a fighter druid, possesses the ability to transform into an owlbear, which tells us that maybe our own druids can also, in time, turn into owlbears, which would be extraordinarily cool. A one-on-one encounter with a Drider, perhaps you can converse with it. Very cool, very interesting. And this is a bit strange because, as I mentioned, Driders are not exactly the possessors of a massive intellect, and on top of that, they're mentally unstable, very unstable, because the transformation renders them basically near psychotic. Many of them have a death wish, many of them recklessly engage in combat with others because they basically want to die. So it's of course possible to have a calm, intelligent Drider, I guess, but this scene is somewhat unusual, and given what I've just explained, it makes it all the more remarkable. Some kind of creature, golden plated. I have, to be perfectly honest, no idea what this could be off the top of my head. I know a fair bit about D&D lore, but for some reason it's escaping me. Probably not a friendly if I had to take a guess on it. Then we see some kind of mechanical undead drow, who I have to be perfectly honest, vaguely resembles the infamous drow Jarlax, who is the leader of the mercenary group called Brigand Darth, and hails from the same city as the legendary drow ranger Drizzt Do'Urden, namely Menzoberranzan. Vaguely looks like this undead creature person, though I have to admit it's mostly the hat, and Jarlax's hat has a feather in it, iconically a magical feather. But to the best of my knowledge, the resemblance isn't one-to-one, and I don't think Jarlax has become a mechanical undead creature based on what I know about his background and history. So I have no idea exactly what this is, but you can see in the drow entourage that the other creatures there are also some kind of undead, presumably, or they have been experimented on in a similar fashion to a Frankenstein's monster, but not entirely clear what this is. Nonetheless, very interesting. And then we have the actual Minsc reveal, seemingly trapped in a mimic, heavily implied that he will be joining the party, probably since he was a captive of the Mind Flayers, probably been implanted with a tadpole. You know my theory already, that he will possibly regain his memories because the tadpole will reactivate them. It's magic. But again, speculating. Very cool stuff. I'm definitely looking forward to it. Definitely be putting out a lot more lore videos in the future as things are ramping up. And I hope you enjoyed that breakdown. Do let me know if I've missed anything. And on top of that, do let me know what you found to be the most interesting new things revealed in the trailer. I'd love to hear about it. And if you haven't checked out my video on the history of Minsc, go ahead and do so, please. Would really appreciate it. The link will be in the description box. And as always, thank you for tuning in. Please leave a like, share, comment, and subscribe, as it really helps out the channel. Appreciate the support. I'll check you out later. Take care. Until the next time.